When a racist security guard humiliates and arrests an undercover FBI agent during a high-stakes investigation, his life spirals into chaos. As he faces the full weight of karma, losing his job and his sense of self, he seeks redemption. But will he ever truly undo the damage caused by his deep-rooted prejudices? And as the agent rises from the experience, can she move past the encounter, or will it haunt her forever? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The late afternoon sun filtered through the wide windows of the mall, casting long shadows on the marble floors. The air was filled with the sound of people shopping, their voices a dull hum against the backdrop of the world's constant motion. Elena Moore was not here to browse or shop. She was on a mission. Dressed in casual clothing, jeans, sneakers, and a plain jacket, she blended in perfectly with the weekend crowd. She appeared relaxed, but every movement she made was calculated, every glance intentional. Elena was one of the FBI's top undercover agents, tasked with investigating a suspected illegal trafficking ring that was said to operate out of this very mall. The target, a man named Ryan Mercer, had been under surveillance for weeks. He was known for slipping through the cracks, always one step ahead of law enforcement. But today, Elena had him in her sights. He was standing near a high-end boutique, speaking to someone Elena hadn't seen before. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the subtle exchanges between them, brief eye contact, a nod, indicated this was no ordinary meeting. Elena's instincts, honed over years in the field, told her something was about to happen. She needed to stay close but discreet. As she moved closer, keeping her distance yet maintaining a clear line of sight, she felt a prickle on the back of her neck. The sensation was familiar. Someone was watching her. She turned casually, her eyes scanning the crowd, and that's when she saw him. Darren Coleman stood at the edge of the mall's main walkway, his uniform marking him as mall security. He was a broad-shouldered man, his eyes sharp with suspicion. But it wasn't Ryan Mercer he was focused on. It was Elena. Darren had been watching her for the last few minutes, his attention drawn not to the subtle details of her investigation, but to her appearance. To him, she didn't belong here. In his mind, the sight of a black woman dressed casually and seemingly wandering the mall was cause for concern. Elena's heart sank. She had dealt with this type of profiling before. It was exhausting, frustrating, and often dangerous. But she couldn't afford to engage with Darren now. She had to stay focused on her target. She turned her attention back to Ryan Mercer, who was now slipping into a side corridor. She needed to follow him, but Darren was already moving toward her. "Excuse me, miss," Darren said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "I need to speak with you." Elena glanced at him but didn't stop. She couldn't afford to lose sight of Mercer. "I'm busy," she muttered, hoping he would let it go. But Darren wasn't the type to be dismissed. He quickened his pace, stepping directly in front of her. "I said, I need to speak with you," he repeated, this time with an edge of authority that drew a few looks from nearby shoppers. "What are you doing here?" Elena kept her face neutral, though a spark of frustration ignited inside her. "I'm shopping," she said, barely concealing the irritation in her voice. "Is that a problem?" Darren narrowed his eyes. "It might be. You've been wandering around for a while now, and you don't seem to be buying anything." Elena took a breath. She had been in situations like this before, and as much as she wanted to tell Darren off, she knew that escalating the situation wouldn't help her mission. She glanced over Darren's shoulder, her heart racing as she saw Mercer disappearing around the corner. She couldn't let this go on any longer. "Listen, I'm an FBI agent," she said, lowering her voice so only Darren could hear. "I'm working on something right now, and I don't have time for this." Darren's expression didn't change. Instead, a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "An FBI agent, huh?" His tone was thick with sarcasm. "You got any proof of that?" Elena reached into her pocket, pulling out her badge and flashing it briefly. "There. Now, if you'll excuse me." Before she could take a step, Darren grabbed her arm. "I don't know if that's real," he said, his voice lowering dangerously. "You could have stolen that for all I know. You need to come with me." Elena's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. She had dealt with men like Darren before, men whose authority gave them a sense of superiority, men who saw people like her as a threat. no matter what proof she had. But this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was jeopardizing her mission. "Let go of my arm," Elena said quietly, her voice steely. "You have no idea what you're doing." But Darren wasn't listening. His grip tightened, and with a quick glance around, he motioned to a nearby security guard. "We've got a problem here," he called out. Elena's heart sank as she watched the second guard approach. The situation was spiraling out of control. Every second she spent dealing with Darren, Mercer was getting further away. Her entire investigation was on the line. "I don't have time for this," Elena said, her voice rising slightly as the second guard reached them. "I'm on an active investigation, and you are interfering with it." "Interfering?" Darren scoffed, now fully convinced that Elena was lying. "The only thing I'm interfering with is whatever you're up to." The second guard, clearly following Darren's lead, moved to block any attempt she might make to walk away. The scene was quickly escalating, with more people beginning to stare. Elena could feel the eyes of bystanders, their curious and judgmental gazes prickling her skin. This was not how she had envisioned her day going. She considered her options carefully. She could make a scene and pull rank, but that could blow her cover entirely. Or she could let Darren drag her off, but that meant losing her target, possibly for good. She was stuck, and all because Darren couldn't see past his own prejudices. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her superior, Agent Rivera, who was coordinating the operation. "Mercer's on the move. Where are you?" Elena's stomach dropped. She had no choice now. She couldn't let her mission fall apart because of Darren's actions. With a quick motion, she pulled out her phone and flashed the screen toward the guards. "If you don't let me go right now, I'm going to make sure every single one of your superiors hears about this." Darren hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But his pride was too strong to back down. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Elena's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a text, it was a direct call from Rivera. Elena answered, her voice sharp. "I'm being detained by mall security," she said without preamble. "They're interfering with the operation." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Rivera's voice came through, low and tense. "Put them on the phone. Now." Elena handed the phone to Darren, her eyes locked on his as realization slowly dawned on him. His face paled as he spoke to Rivera, his voice faltering. Whatever Rivera said, it was enough to make Darren's grip loosen, his bravado slipping away. When Darren handed the phone back, he looked at Elena with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. I didn't know," he stammered. "I thought." Elena didn't wait for him to finish. She stepped past him, her heart pounding. She had lost valuable time, and now she had to make up for it. She walked briskly toward the corridor where she had last seen Mercer, her mind racing. Behind her, Darren stood frozen, watching her go. He had made a terrible mistake, and he knew it. The weight of his actions would hit him soon enough, but for now, all he could do was stare at the consequences of his prejudice disappearing into the crowd. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Darren Coleman. His encounter with Elena had left him shaken, though he wasn't entirely sure why. After she had walked away, the full gravity of the situation hadn't yet sunk in. He had tried to brush it off, reassuring himself that he was only doing his job, but there was no way he could have known she was an FBI agent. Yet, as the evening wore on, doubt began to creep in, worming its way through his usual self-confidence. Darren sat in the break room of the mall security office, staring blankly at the cold cup of coffee in front of him. The room was small, windowless, and stale. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, adding to the already tense atmosphere. It was quiet now, long after the mall had closed for the day. Most of the other guards had gone home, but Darren lingered. He wasn't ready to face whatever waited for him outside. The incident with Elena kept replaying in his mind. He had handled plenty of situations before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just that he had detained a federal agent. It was the way she had looked at him, the quiet fury in her eyes. Darren couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper that he had missed in those tense moments. For years, Darren had prided himself on his ability to read people. It was something his father had drilled into him from a young age. Trust your instincts. Keep an eye on people who don't fit the mold. His father, a retired police officer, had built his career on that mindset. Darren had grown up hearing stories of how his father could spot trouble a mile away, how he always knew who was up to no good. Darren had absorbed those lessons like a sponge. He had idolized his father, wanted nothing more than to follow in his footsteps. But his father had always been tough, hard to please. Nothing Darren did was ever good enough. His father had made that clear time and time again. Even when Darren had landed the job as a security guard, his father's response had been dismissive. "Mall cop?" his father had scoffed. "That's not real police work, son. You're just babysitting teenagers and shoplifters." Darren had brushed it off at the time, but deep down, the words had stung. He wanted to prove to his father that he could do more, be more. That was part of why he had approached Elena so aggressively. She didn't look like she belonged, at least not in the way Darren had been taught to perceive it. And he had acted on that instinct, as he always did. But now, sitting in the empty break room, Darren began to wonder if those instincts had led him astray. The realization was unsettling, something he wasn't ready to fully confront. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his girlfriend, Lucy. "How's your shift going? You okay? Haven't heard from you." Darren stared at the message for a long moment before typing a short reply. "Darren? It's fine. Just a long day." He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't want to tell her about the incident with Elena. Lucy was different from him, more open-minded. She volunteered at a local community center, working with disadvantaged youth, many of whom were from minority backgrounds. They had had disagreements before about race and prejudice, though they tried to avoid the topic. Darren didn't want to deal with the inevitable conversation that would follow if he told her what had happened. He put the phone down without sending anything more. Instead, Darren's thoughts drifted back to his father. He could still hear his voice, gruff and authoritative, echoing in his mind. "You've got to be tough out there, Darren. People will try to take advantage of you if you're not careful. Never show weakness." His father's words had shaped so much of who Darren had become, but now, in the stillness of the empty room, Darren began to question whether those lessons had been right. He had always trusted his instincts, but what if his instincts were wrong? What if they had been warped by years of listening to his father's narrow worldview? The door to the break room creaked open, and Darren looked up to see Paul, one of his coworkers, step in. Paul was older, a veteran of the security team, and someone Darren had always gotten along with. He was the kind of guy who kept his head down and didn't get involved in drama. But tonight, there was a strange look on his face, something between concern and disappointment. "Hey, Darren," Paul said, pulling up a chair across from him. "I heard about what happened today." Darren felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't expected the news to spread so quickly. Paul sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I know everything that went down, but I've been around long enough to know when someone's made a mistake." Darren's defenses went up immediately. "I didn't make a mistake," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I was just doing my job. How was I supposed to know she was an FBI agent?" Paul raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained calm. "That's not really the point, is it?" Darren frowned, crossing his arms. "What's that supposed to mean?" Paul leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "It means that it's not just about her being an FBI agent. It's about the fact that you saw her and assumed the worst. You didn't give her a chance to explain. You jumped to conclusions because of how she looked." Darren opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew Paul was right. He had made assumptions about Elena based solely on her appearance, just like he had done with countless others before her. But admitting that was harder than he had expected. "I've been doing this job a long time, Darren," Paul continued, his voice low but firm. "And I've seen a lot of people make the same mistakes. It's easy to let our biases get in the way, even when we don't realize it. But if you don't start thinking about why you're making the choices you're making, you're going to find yourself in situations like this more often than you'd like." Darren stared at the table, unable to meet Paul's gaze. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. "I'm not saying you're a bad guy," Paul added, his tone softening. "But you've got to take a hard look at yourself, man. This job, it's not just about catching bad guys. It's about protecting people, all people, and sometimes that means protecting them from our own biases." The silence stretched between them, and for the first time in a long while, Darren didn't have a snappy comeback or a quick defense. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't before. The walls he had built around himself, walls reinforced by years of following his father's teachings, were starting to crack. Paul stood up, giving Darren a nod before heading for the door. "Think about it, Darren. That's all I'm saying." As the door clicked shut behind him, Darren was left alone again, his mind racing. The doubts that had been simmering all evening were now boiling over, and for the first time, he began to consider the possibility that Paul was right, that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Darren looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his phone. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, a man who had always believed he was in the right, who had never questioned his own actions. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure, and that uncertainty was terrifying. The following days weighed heavily on Darren Coleman. As much as he tried to push the incident out of his mind, it lingered, gnawing at him in the quiet moments. His usual routines at work felt off-kilter, and the once familiar hum of the mall now felt alien, almost hostile. Every time he passed the corridor where he had stopped Elena Moore, his stomach twisted. There was no avoiding the fact that things had changed, not just in the mall, but inside him. The repercussions of that day were quick to come. Darren had hoped that the situation might blow over quietly, that Elena would decide not to pursue any action, but he had been wrong. A formal complaint had been filed with mall management, and not just from Elena, but from the FBI itself. The investigation that followed put Darren under a microscope. Sitting across from his boss, Officer Blake, Darren felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. Blake was an older man, seasoned and no-nonsense. He had always been firm but fair, the type of supervisor Darren could respect. But today, there was a different energy in the room, a mix of disappointment and frustration. Blake leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he looked at Darren. "We have a problem," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And it's not just about you detaining an FBI agent." Darren tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I didn't know who she was at the time. She wasn't in uniform, and she wasn't acting like law enforcement." Blake's eyes narrowed. "That's not the issue here, Darren. The issue is why you assumed she wasn't law enforcement. Why you didn't stop and think before escalating the situation." Darren swallowed, unsure of how to respond. He had gone over the events in his mind countless times, trying to justify his actions, but each time the answers seemed to slip further away. He had acted on instinct, the same instinct his father had drilled into him for years. But for the first time, Darren was beginning to realize that maybe those instincts weren't as sharp as he had always believed. Blake sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, Darren, I'm not going to pretend this is easy. We all make mistakes. But this is serious. I've had to explain to corporate why one of my guards detained a federal agent based on nothing more than a gut feeling, and I'm not sure they're going to let this slide." Darren's heart sank. "Am I getting fired?" Blake's expression softened slightly, but the tension in the room didn't lift. "You're suspended for now. We're conducting a full investigation, and depending on how that goes, we'll determine if you'll keep your job." Suspended. The word hit Darren like a punch to the gut. He had never been suspended before. Never been in trouble like this. He opened his mouth to argue, to try to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew there was no easy way out of this. "Go home," Blake said, his tone final. "Take some time to think about what happened, and be ready for a formal review." Darren stood, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He nodded, unable to meet Blake's eyes, and left the office. As he walked through the empty hallways of the mall, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching his life unravel from a distance. When he got home, Lucy was waiting for him. She had been watching the news, her face tight with concern. She had heard about the incident. Of course she had. It was all over the local media now. The story of a black FBI agent being detained by a security guard in a mall had ignited a firestorm of controversy, and Darren's name was right in the middle of it. Darren, Lucy said softly as he stepped through the door. What happened? He dropped his keys on the table, feeling the weight of everything bearing down on him. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice hollow. I didn't know she was an agent. Lucy shook her head, her brow furrowed. It's not about whether you knew or not. It's about why you thought you had to stop her in the first place. Darren felt a surge of defensiveness rise up. I was doing my job, Lucy. She was acting suspicious, and I thought. You thought what? Lucy interrupted, her voice sharper than usual. You thought because she was black and dressed casually that she must be up to something? Her words hung in the air between them, cutting through the tension like a blade. Darren wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but he couldn't. He had heard this from Paul, from Blake, and now from Lucy. The more they said it, the harder it was for Darren to deny what he had done. Lucy sighed, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. I've been trying to explain this to you for a long time, Darren. You can't just look at people and assume you know who they are or what they're doing based on how they look. Darren dropped onto the couch, his head in his hands. He felt tired, more tired than he had ever felt in his life. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lucy watched him for a moment, the anger in her expression softening. She walked over and sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. It's not about fixing it, Darren. It's about learning from it. You need to start seeing people for who they are, not for who you think they are. Darren stared at the floor, his mind racing. He thought about his father, about all the years he had spent listening to his warnings, following his advice. His father had always seen the world in black and white, good guys and bad guys. But maybe it wasn't that simple. Maybe it had never been that simple. Lucy's voice was soft but firm. You need to apologize to her. Darren looked up, surprised. What? You need to apologize to Elena, Lucy repeated. Not because it will make everything go away, but because it's the right thing to do. Darren opened his mouth to protest, but the look in Lucy's eyes stopped him. She wasn't angry anymore, but there was a quiet determination in her expression that told him she wasn't going to let this go. I don't even know how to contact her, Darren said, his voice small. Lucy nodded. I can help with that. I know someone who works at the FBI office downtown. I can get her contact information. Darren's stomach twisted at the thought. He had never apologized like this before. It wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about acknowledging everything he had done, everything he had been wrong about. And that was harder than anything he had ever faced. But he knew Lucy was right. If he didn't take this step, if he didn't at least try to make amends, he would never be able to move forward. His career, his relationships, his own sense of self, everything was at stake. The next day, after hours of hesitation and soul-searching, Darren found himself sitting at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand. Lucy had gotten Elena's contact information, and now all that was left was to make the call. His hand shook as he dialed the number, and for a moment he considered hanging up. But he couldn't run from this. Not anymore. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. Agent Moore. Darren swallowed hard, his throat dry. Hi, this is Darren Coleman, from the mall. There was a pause, and Darren could almost feel the tension on the other end of the line. I remember, Elena said, her voice cold but controlled. Darren took a deep breath, his mind racing to find the right words. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I know what I did was wrong, and I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I let my assumptions get in the way, and I know that's not an excuse. The silence on the other end stretched on, making Darren's heart race even faster. I appreciate the apology, Elena said finally, though her voice remained distant. But it doesn't change what happened. I know, Darren replied quickly. I just want you to know I'm going to do better. I'm going to learn from this. Another pause, and Darren could hear Elena exhale softly. Good, she said, her tone softening slightly. Because it's not just about me. It's about everyone else who might find themselves in that same situation. Darren nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. I understand, and I'm sorry. They exchanged a few more words before the call ended, leaving Darren feeling both relieved and unsettled. The apology was just the first step, and he knew it wouldn't undo the damage he had caused. But for the first time in a long while, Darren felt like he was moving in the right direction. The ripples of that day's actions would continue to spread, affecting not just Darren but everyone around him. But with each step he took toward understanding, Darren began to see the world a little more clearly. And maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. As the days passed, Elena Moore returned to her work, but the encounter with Darren Coleman lingered in the back of her mind. She had experienced prejudice before, countless times in fact, but something about that particular day in the mall had left a deeper scar. It wasn't just the indignity of being racially profiled by someone who should have protected her. It was the exhausting reminder of how pervasive and ingrained those biases were. For the next week, she buried herself in her investigation, using the distraction to push thoughts of the incident aside. The case she was working on was gaining momentum. The suspect she had been tailing, Ryan Mercer, was one of the linchpins of a vast criminal organization involved in trafficking illicit goods. For months, Elena and her team had gathered evidence, inching closer to taking down the entire operation. But the work had its toll. It was relentless, and the weight of responsibility was heavy. Elena had always known that being in the FBI came with sacrifices, but the pressure to prove herself, not just as a competent agent, but as a black woman in a predominantly white male institution, was always there. She knew her every move was scrutinized more closely than her colleagues. The incident with Darren was a reminder that no matter how high she climbed, the shadow of bias followed. Still, Elena pushed forward. She had a job to do, and despite the emotional toll of the past week, she wouldn't let anything distract her from bringing Mercer and his associates to justice. One evening, as Elena sat at her desk reviewing surveillance footage, her phone buzzed with a message from Agent Rivera, her supervisor. It was short and to the point, as Rivera's messages often were. "Rivera, new intel. We've got a lead. Meet me tomorrow morning for a briefing." Elena's pulse quickened. A new lead could mean they were close to making a breakthrough in the case. She couldn't afford to let her personal frustrations cloud her judgment now. The next day, she arrived at the FBI field office early, mentally preparing for whatever developments lay ahead. Rivera was waiting for her in the conference room, his expression serious. "We've got confirmation that Mercer will be making a major transaction within the next 48 hours, he began, pointing to a map on the screen. "It's going down at a warehouse just outside the city. We need eyes on the ground, and you're going to lead the team." Elena nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a high-stakes mission. This was her chance to finish what she had started, to bring down one of the biggest players in the trafficking ring. But as Rivera continued to explain the plan, Elena's thoughts drifted for a brief moment back to the incident with Darren. She hadn't expected him to call and apologize, and while she had appreciated the gesture, it hadn't erased the frustration or anger she felt. It was something she had long since learned to manage. The balancing act of maintaining professionalism while navigating the personal slights and indignities that came with being a woman of color in her line of work. She refocused on the briefing. There was no room for distraction now. This operation needed to be airtight. The night of the stakeout arrived quickly. Elena and her team were stationed near the warehouse, watching as Mercer and his associates arrived in a convoy of black SUVs. The air was thick with tension as the agents communicated quietly through earpieces, each one waiting for the signal to move in. Elena's heart pounded, but her focus was sharp. Every detail mattered now. As she watched through her binoculars, she spotted Mercer stepping out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 bodyguards. They were carrying what appeared to be heavy cases, likely filled with the illicit goods they had been tracking. Elena gave the signal for her team to be ready. But then, something unexpected happened. A car that wasn't part of Mercer's convoy pulled up to the side of the warehouse. The man who stepped out wasn't one of Mercer's known associates. It was Darren Coleman. Elena's stomach dropped. What was he doing here? Her mind raced through the possibilities. Had Darren somehow become involved with Mercer's operation? Was he working for the criminals, or was this some strange coincidence? Either way, his presence was a complication she hadn't anticipated. Elena's earpiece crackled to life as Rivera's voice came through. "Do you see that?" What's Coleman doing here? I don't know, Elena replied, her voice low and controlled. But we can't let him interfere. If he's part of this, we need to handle it carefully. Rivera hesitated. I don't want to blow our cover. You're going to have to deal with him quietly. Elena's heart raced. She couldn't afford any mistakes. If Darren was involved with Mercer, this operation was about to get a lot more complicated. She signaled to one of her team members to keep an eye on Darren while she continued monitoring Mercer. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with mounting tension. Finally, as Mercer's men began loading the cases into the warehouse, Elena knew the time had come to make a move. She gave the signal, and the team prepared to move in. Before they could, Darren made his way toward the building's side entrance, a determined look on his face. It was clear he wasn't just a bystander. Whatever his role was, it was now clear that he was involved, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in something dangerous. Elena's pulse quickened. There was no time to think this through. She had to act. Elena slipped from her vantage point, moving quickly and silently toward the side of the warehouse where Darren had disappeared. She caught up with him just as he was about to enter the building. Darren, she hissed, grabbing his arm. He spun around, eyes wide with surprise. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. I could ask you the same thing, Elena said, keeping her voice low. You need to get out of here. You have no idea what's going on. Darren looked around, clearly unsettled. I'm trying to fix this, he said hurriedly. I messed up. I heard about this deal going down, and I thought if I could. Fix this? Elena interrupted, her frustration rising. You have no idea what you're stepping into. This isn't something you can just fix by showing up. Darren's face tightened with guilt and desperation. I'm trying to make things right. I thought if I could help. Help? Elena shook her head. You're making things worse. I have an entire team here, and now I have to worry about you getting caught in the crossfire. Darren's expression shifted, his bravado fading. He looked at Elena with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what I did. I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things. This is my way of trying to make it right. Elena stared at him for a moment, torn between anger and understanding. She could see that Darren was sincere, but sincerity didn't change the fact that his presence was jeopardizing the entire operation. Look, if you really want to make this right, you need to leave. Now, she said firmly. This is bigger than you think, and if you stay, you're going to get hurt, or worse, you'll compromise the entire investigation. Darren hesitated, his eyes searching Elena's face for some sign of forgiveness. But there was no time for forgiveness now. There was only the mission. Please, Elena said, her tone softening just a fraction. If you really want to make amends, start by not making this worse. For a moment, Darren looked like he was going to argue, but then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. I'll go. Elena watched as he turned and left, disappearing into the night. She hoped she had done the right thing by letting him walk away, but there was no time to dwell on it now. She had a job to finish. The operation went off without a hitch after that. Mercer and his men were taken into custody, the evidence secured, and the case was closed. But as the dust settled and the adrenaline wore off, Elena found herself thinking about Darren. She couldn't quite shake the image of his face, the mixture of guilt and desperation that had clouded his features when he had tried to explain himself. In the days that followed, Elena returned to her usual routine. The case had been a success, and she was hailed as a key player in bringing down Mercer's operation. But the encounter with Darren left her with a strange sense of unease. Despite everything, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to his attempt at redemption. Maybe, just maybe, people like Darren could change. But even if they could, that didn't mean the damage they caused could be undone. For now, Elena chose to focus on the future, on the cases yet to be solved, the wrongs yet to be righted. And she knew that the fight against prejudice, in all its forms, was far from over. The aftermath of the operation was a whirlwind of paperwork, debriefings, and congratulations. Elena Moore found herself being lauded for her role in bringing down Ryan Mercer's trafficking ring. She should have felt a sense of accomplishment. After all, this was one of the most significant cases of her career. But despite the success, Elena couldn't shake the weight of what had transpired outside the warehouse. Her mind kept drifting back to Darren Coleman and the brief but intense encounter they had shared. She had watched Darren walk away that night, a broken man desperately seeking redemption. He had come there, thinking he could somehow fix things, unaware that his mere presence could have endangered everything. His attempt to help had only revealed how deeply out of his depth he truly was. And yet there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of real remorse. Elena had seen it before. People who had made terrible mistakes, blinded by their own biases, trying to find a way to make amends once the damage was done. But those people rarely got the chance to undo the harm they caused, and Darren's situation seemed no different. The road to redemption, if there was one for him, would be long and unforgiving. For the next few days, Elena tried to focus on moving forward. She threw herself into her work, determined not to let Darren's presence distract her from the cases that still needed her attention. But one morning, as she sat at her desk reviewing evidence for a new investigation, her phone buzzed with a message that pulled her back into the gravity of their shared history. It was from Lucy, Darren's girlfriend. Elena had met Lucy only once, briefly, at a community event, and they hadn't spoken since. Seeing her name flash across the screen now was unexpected. The message was short but clear. "Lucy, Darren's in a bad place. I thought you should know." Elena stared at the message, her mind racing. She had no obligation to involve herself in Darren's life any further. He wasn't her problem. And yet something tugged at her. A sense of unfinished business, perhaps, or maybe a desire to see the man she had encountered that night confront the full consequences of his actions. Taking a deep breath, Elena replied, "Elena, what do you mean by bad place?" Lucy's response came quickly. "Lucy, he's lost his job. The investigation into what happened at the mall concluded and he was let go. He's been spiraling ever since, and I don't know how to help him." Elena closed her eyes, letting out a long sigh. Of course, Darren had lost his job. There was no way the mall's security department would have kept him on after the public fallout. It had been all over the news. The story of a black FBI agent being wrongfully detained by a mall security guard, the public outrage, the internal investigation. Darren had become the face of everything wrong with racial profiling in that brief, humiliating moment. Elena couldn't deny that some part of her felt justified. Darren had, after all, acted on his prejudices, and now he was facing the consequences. But as much as she wanted to put him out of her mind, she couldn't ignore Lucy's message. Something about Darren had changed since that day at the mall. Elena had seen it in the way he had tried to explain himself at the warehouse, in the apology he had stammered out on the phone. He wasn't the same arrogant security guard she had encountered weeks ago. He was a man on the verge of unraveling, and while she didn't owe him anything, Elena wondered if there was something she could do. A few days later, Elena found herself standing outside a modest apartment complex on the edge of town. Lucy had given her the address, along with a plea for help. She had hesitated before coming, unsure if this was the right move, but something inside her told her to see it through. Elena knocked on the door, her heart heavy with uncertainty. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a disheveled Darren. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes rumpled, and there was a hollowness to his face that hadn't been there before. He blinked in surprise when he saw Elena standing on his doorstep. "Elena?" Darren's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken much in recent days. "What are you doing here?" Elena swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Lucy told me what's been going on. I wanted to check on you." Darren stepped back, opening the door wider, though he seemed unsure of what to say. Elena took that as an invitation and stepped inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clear that Darren had let things go. Dishes were piled up in the sink, and clothes were strewn across the living room. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken despair. Darren slumped onto the couch, his hands resting on his knees. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. "I didn't expect you to show up." Elena took a seat in a nearby chair, watching him carefully. "I didn't expect to come," she admitted. "But Lucy reached out to me, and I figured maybe it was time we talked." Darren ran a hand through his hair, his eyes downcast. "I messed up," he said quietly, the words heavy with regret. "I lost everything because of what I did. My job, Lucy's on the verge of leaving me, and I can't blame her. I've been a wreck." Elena nodded slowly, not interrupting. She had expected Darren to be defensive, to try and rationalize his actions, but the man sitting before her now was nothing like the one she had met weeks ago. This was someone who had been broken by the consequences of his actions. "I thought I could make things right," Darren continued, his voice cracking slightly. "After what happened at the mall, I thought if I just did something good, maybe I could fix it. But I just made things worse." Elena leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't undo what happened, Darren. No amount of good deeds will change the fact that you made assumptions about me because of the way I look. And you're not the only one. There are thousands of people who face what I did every single day." Darren's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of guilt and shame. "I know. I see that now. I didn't see it before, but now I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I look in the mirror, I see the person who humiliated you, who acted on those prejudices. And it makes me sick." Elena didn't flinch. She had heard similar sentiments from others before, people who had only realized the extent of their biases after they had caused harm. But she had never been one to offer easy forgiveness. "It's not enough to feel bad about what happened," she said quietly. "Feeling guilty doesn't change anything. If you really want to make a difference, you need to understand why you did what you did and work to change it." Darren nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm trying," he whispered, "but I don't know where to start." Elena stood, her gaze steady as she looked down at him. "Start by listening, start by learning, and most importantly, start by accepting that change isn't about one big gesture. It's about the small, everyday choices you make. The way you treat people, the assumptions you challenge in yourself. That's how you start to make amends." For a long moment, Darren was silent, absorbing her words. He seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of his own actions had crushed the bravado he once carried. Elena could see that he was at the beginning of a long and difficult journey, one that might never fully heal the wounds he had caused, but at least he was beginning to understand. As she turned to leave, Darren spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Elena, for giving me a chance to make things right." Elena paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. She glanced back at Darren, her expression thoughtful. "Don't thank me yet. You still have a long way to go." With that, she left the apartment, stepping out into the cool evening air. As she walked to her car, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. Anger, sadness, but also a flicker of hope. Darren had been hit with the full weight of karma, and it had nearly destroyed him. But now at least he had a choice. To let it break him entirely, or to rebuild himself into something better. As for Elena, she knew that her own journey was far from over. There would always be more challenges, more battles to fight against prejudice and discrimination. But as she got into her car and drove away, she felt a quiet sense of resolve. Change didn't happen overnight, and the world wouldn't be fixed by a single act of redemption. But it was in the small moments, the everyday actions, where real progress was made. And for now, that was enough. In the months that followed, Darren slowly began to rebuild his life. He found work volunteering with an organization dedicated to combating racial bias and educating others about the dangers of prejudice. It wasn't easy, and the guilt he carried weighed on him every day. But with each step, he tried to become a better version of himself. One who listened, who learned, and who fought against the very assumptions that had once defined him. Elena continued her work as an FBI agent, rising through the ranks and earning the respect of her peers. The incident with Darren had left a mark on her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. She knew there were many more like him out there, people who needed to confront their biases and learn from their mistakes. And while she couldn't change the world overnight, she could keep pushing forward, one case at a time. In the end, the weight of karma had fallen on both of them, but in very different ways. And while the road ahead was uncertain, both Darren and Elena knew that they had the power to shape their futures, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.